All right, if you want a cup of tea or an extra cup of coffee or need to throw away some stuff, now would be the time to do that. I'm hopeful that you solved all the world's problems and got perfect answers for all of the questions. Did you think these were too easy? I get strange looks when I ask that. Like I said, I tried to think of a few questions that they're about the subjects that we're going to cover, but they're a little bit more directed or to help you think. I got to sit at one table for a little bit, and they were talking about the question on gossip and the boundary line for gossip. And I would say it's not easy to know exactly what all of that is. We'll cover it when we get to Origen, because he's probably the victim of some malicious gossip historically, and it's hard to know exactly what his situation was. And for instance, why he's not considered a saint. So we'll get there. But in a lot of cases, it's hard to come up with a clear and fast rule. There's parts of life that resist systematizing, where you can't just fit it into nice, even boxes. You kind of have to, it depends a little bit on the situation. It depends a little bit on what's going on and what's said and what your intention is, and there's lots of pieces that get mixed in. So to begin with, much of this chapter, Cyprian of Carthage, this is Origen and the Church at Alexandria, takes place in North Africa. And one of the things that we have a very different understanding of now is what the church in North Africa was like. Anyone know why? What changed between then and now that makes a huge difference in how we think about Africa?
Communication skills.
Well, that part, communication, yep. But something else, a major historical event in the 600s. The Muslim conquest. So they come across North Africa, so Egypt, modern day Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, those are the countries across the north end of Africa, and they're all Muslim majority. But that is a result of the destruction of the North African church that happens because of a group called anyone read ahead? The group called the Vandals. The Vandals are bad enough in history that vandalism made its way into the language of people. So vandalism comes from this group called the Vandals. We'll get there eventually too. I realized I was doing some thinking about our Bible study, and my goal is to get through about the first 1,000 years, like our book, by the end of May-ish. We'll see if we make it, but that's kind of the goal. So to review a little bit, for the church in North Africa, it's actually quite strong very early on, and it's a little bit surprising. But if you remember, we mentioned before, the city of Alexandria is kind of the capital of North Africa. So Alexandria in Egypt, and then the next city would be Carthage, which is outside of modern day Tunis, the capital of Tunisia. I don't think there were major Roman settlements to the west of there that I can recall. It was kind of Alexandria and Carthage were the two major centers of life in North Africa. And Judaism was quite strong there. If you remember, we talked about the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament is a Greek version of the Old Testament. It's abbreviated LXX, which is the Roman numerals for 70. That's where the name comes from, that it was translated by 70 scholars. So the Septuagint was a Greek translation that was done in Alexandria. Alexandria had the largest Jewish population outside of the Holy Land at that time. And the results, or the movement of Christianity, by and large started in Jewish synagogues. If you remember when we talked about the book of Acts, how Paul and even Peter almost always go to the Jewish synagogue first. That pattern repeated itself in places like North Africa. So there's a lot more in common between Judaism and Christianity than between Christianity and the paganism that was present in the region at the time, whether it was Roman or Egyptian. So the Jewish communities that were in North Africa become fertile soil for Christianity to start spreading. It also seems like North Africa, at least for the most part, experienced fewer persecutions than other areas of the empire. The city of Carthage has some, but not to the degree or to the extent that other areas in the empire do. So there are martyrs in North Africa. There are many stories of them, but again, it's probably because the Christians remembered or wrote down a majority of the stories of the martyrs. This was one of their projects. So there's persecutions there, but there's probably not as many. Christianity is spreading. This area is also very, very unique because it was heavily impacted by the Greek philosophical tradition. One of the things that you might remember from history is the great library at Alexandria. Anyone know the name of the founder of the great library at Alexandria? They were the ruling family of Egypt after the Greek conquest. The Ptolemies, spelled Ptolmy. The Ptolemies. And there's a whole bunch of them. I think it was the first one that was the founder of the library at Alexandria. But Alexandria is the largest city in the world at this time. So Alexandria is a city of somewhere around in the neighborhood of 1 million people, maybe 1.5 million people. It's dramatically larger than other places, and it had become a center of the Greek philosophical tradition. So if you're looking at like the great works of Western literature, many of them are connected to this area in Alexandria, where you have a meeting point between the Hebrew scriptures and Greek philosophy and early Christianity. You have the confluence of those things together in Alexandria. And Carthage is somewhat the same way. You also there's one other major piece about the area in North Africa that's fantastically important for the Roman Empire. This one's a little bit more simple and basic. Anyone guess what it is? Something that North Dakota is good at. Agriculture and farming. Exactly. Italy was settled enough that the Italians couldn't grow enough food. The Romans in Italy couldn't grow enough food for the city of Rome and some of the surrounding countryside because there were so many people there. And so Africa, specifically the Nile Delta region, which is very fertile and very easy to grow things because it's hot, but they have water from irrigation from the Nile, and Spain become the major grain import centers for Rome. One of the famous emperors has the phrase like bread and circuses. You feed the people and entertain them, and then they don't riot and kill you. I forget, it's one of the bad emperors. I think it might be Nero who says that. There's someone. So North Africa has this kind of confluence of things. So because it provides food for Italy, it's very, very tied to Rome, even though they're kind of further in the east. Carthage is somewhat south of Rome, just across the Mediterranean and across Sicily, so across the sea, but Alexandria is much to the east, but they're more tied to Rome than, say, Caesarea or the Greek cities in Turkey, in Asia Minor. And this area, it's a little bit like Canada is now. If you've looked at some of the things about the Canadian population, something like 80 or 90% of the people in Canada live within 100 miles of the border with the United States. Like, Canada is the second largest country in the world, and there's only a little tiny strip of land along the United States that's actually settled, and most of the rest of it is wide open spaces, to the tune of hundreds or thousands of miles. North Africa is like that. There's a little ribbon of civilization that's along the Mediterranean, because it's cooler than the hot desert, and because the rain that does fall tends to fall on the coastal areas. Africa has a very dramatic rise between the inlands and the coast, and that kind of dramatic rise leads to the formation of rain clouds. So if it does rain, these places are sources of water, or in Egypt, there's the Nile. But to the south of it, it has a lot of political stability because there's a giant desert that basically provides a land barrier for everything to the south. They don't cross it very easily, except for maybe caravans of camels. But you can't take an army across the Sahara. I think even today, you don't take an army across the Sahara. And if you look at the fights like in North Africa in World War II, most of them happen even in that coastal region, because that's where the people are, that's where the stuff is that you want to control. No one really fights over how many sand dunes you own in the desert. They're just not all that important. So the desert is this massive protective barrier to the south. And this ends up giving North Africa a lot of political stability because you can't invade it easily. It has to be invaded by sea, or you have to go way around, either through Egypt. The western coast of Africa is actually not very friendly either. Once you get further south into Senegal and Gambia, and you start getting into the more temperate regions, rainforest and those kinds of things, it's not so hard. But if you look at the modern day sort of country of Western Sahara and Mauritania and the southern part of Morocco, the desert goes basically right up to the ocean. You have ocean and sand dunes. So it's largely safe from the south. So the church starts growing. The foundation in Alexandria is credited to Saint Mark, the author of the gospel. But it's, there were probably some Christians in Africa before Saint Mark. They just like to have a famous founder. That's the way it works most of the time. Kind of like there were likely Christians before Peter and Paul arrived in Rome, but Peter and Paul are considered to be the founders of Roman Christianity. You like to claim apostles when they came to visit. There are some groups of martyrs, especially by the late 100s and early 200s. In Africa, the church and converts were spreading into different social classes. And so just as an example, so you can kind of feel how things have changed, because it's hard to imagine what exactly the landscape was like. Alexandria and Carthage are major cities, but there had to be quite a few of them, because the African church very early on starts holding councils. They bring bishops together to debate things and to deal with disciplinary issues. The first council that the Africans call is in Carthage in 235, and at that time 18 bishops join. you have to remember that travel isn't all that easy. Many of them probably came by ship. You'd go to the coast and sail because it'd be easier than trying to cross the land, even close to the Mediterranean. By 250, so 15 years later, 87 bishops come. That's a lot of ordinations in 15 years. And these are just bishops, which gives you a sense that if there's 87 bishops, there's likely, they maybe don't all have their own diocese, but there's likely a number of dioceses that are made up of numbers of parishes. Now, they're probably not as geographically huge as stuff like North Dakota is, or Wyoming, those kind of things, where a diocese would stretch hundreds of miles and you basically couldn't have it without car travel or train travel. They certainly don't have trains. I would rather ride on a train than a camel. I've never ridden on a camel, but I think the trains are nicer. Just speculating. So you can see that if there's 87 bishops already at a council in 250, that's quite widespread already. There's a lot of Christians, or at least there's a lot of dioceses around. There's Christians, they're founding parishes, there's communities. This is the time of the oldest church buildings that we have aren't in Africa as far as we know. Now, some of them could have been there. They were probably destroyed by the Vandals, but the oldest ones are in parts of Syria. So again, they probably met in larger houses. If there was a wealthier person in the community, they would host the Christian gatherings at their home or their estate. 250 is about the time of the Decian persecution that we were talking about last time. That was the first empire-wide one. That persecution does start to hit North Africa harder than the ones in the past did. The ones in the past before that seem to have been more localized. In 250, this is more widespread. There's many martyrs. And groups start to fall away. And that's going to become an important controversy in the North African church, because one of the things that happens in North Africa is this is the foundation, the seat of monasticism, and the monks are sort of like spiritual Marines. They spend time praying and studying, and they have a conflict, or this conflict arises with a group that breaks away during persecution. What do you do with people who publicly denied the faith in the danger of death? Can you readmit them to Holy Communion? Can you readmit them to the church? And if so, when? That becomes one of the defining characteristics of the North African church. It's called the conflict with the lapsi or lapsi, the lapsed, those who denied faith, especially in times of persecution. Monasticism, after its foundation in Egypt, probably in the early-ish 300s, it spreads very, very rapidly through North Africa. Hundreds, thousands of people go out into hundreds of monasteries, mostly in the deserts on the edge of the cities, and start to pray and live. We'll have to sort of bookmark that controversy and the controversy with the lapsed, because it'll come back. Christianity is a religion of learning. This we have a strong Jewish inheritance with. If you've remembered, we talked before about Judaism and its connection to learning. That God speaks in words that can be written down, and because God's words are written down, it can be studied. It can be known. And that becomes an important religious encounter with the Lord, to be able to read His written word. And so Judaism, and probably even more so Christianity, have a much stronger educational bent than Roman paganism did. or than Egyptian paganism did, because learning to read the words of God is different than reading the words of the king. Like, the king wants you to read his words so he can tell you what to do. And most people don't want him to do that because, I don't know, it's sort of like if you start getting letters from the IRS, they're annoying because most of the time it costs you money. And sometimes they send completely innocent letters, and you still get annoyed because you're suspicious that they're up to something. I got one recently about some like healthcare thing or just something, and I was like, why did you do this? You know, you see a letter from the IRS and their official envelopes and all that, and it's like, what happened? And then it ended up being just this piece of paper that was like, well, I don't even know what that is, but it's junk. So that's sort of like the attitude that a lot of Romans likely had, that learning and writing was kind of a function of government, somewhat a function of business. The wealthy had it, but maybe it wasn't the most important thing in the world. Christianity and Judaism have a different sensibility about it. Also because God is reasonable. The Greek text of the Gospel of John talks about Jesus as logos. Logos means reason, rationality, order, that God is knowable, that he is ordered, that reality has a plan and a purpose, and that you can discover that purpose by studying it. So Christianity and Judaism have this tradition of studying the Word of God and of having religious debates. This is where the scribes and the Pharisees come from. And recall, in the Gospels, the scribes and the Pharisees usually get the short end of the stick, and they're kind of off base. They're off kilter. You know, Jesus has more fights with the scribes and the Pharisees than he has probably with any other group of people. But they're not all bad. That many of his followers address him as rabbi. They see him making rabbinical arguments. Like, this is what rabbis did. That's part of this tradition of learning and understanding and encounter. That's the basis of the synagogue system, and that spreads into Christianity very, very early on. It also helps that scholars, very, very smart people, are some of the early Christian converts. And so they write works to explain the Christian faith to others. And we're going to cover some of them today. We have a bugger of a problem in the middle of this, though, and probably somewhat of a false idea of how this worked, because you will likely have been told that literacy in the ancient world was terrible. You know, modern literacy rates are about as high as you can get them without clubbing people over the head with books. The number of people that can read and write now is most of society. At least read and write something. In the ancient world, that wasn't the case. But there is a strong and vociferous debate about exactly how many people could read and write in the time of the Romans. And there's arguments to be made. It's certainly less than it is now, because books were less common, all of those kinds of things. Stuff had to be copied by hand. That was a major part of it as well. But it does seem like people could read some things. Maybe not a lot, but sometimes they'd know like the letters for their name or that kind of thing. However, one of the counter examples that I have read, which is very, very fascinating, is from Jewish records that were found at Masada on the Dead Sea. So in the Roman conquest of the Holy Land, or in the Roman, when they attacked the rebellious Jews in the 70s and in the 130s, eventually they hole up in this desert fortress that Herod built on the top of a plateau. So it's like, you know, one of those very steep walls. They're about 1,000 feet high, and on top of it he built a fortress. It's called Masada, and that was the last holdout of the Jewish rebels. They found a room where these Jewish rebels, these soldiers, were It was one of the last places where there were people alive. And I think they found something like, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. Was it 50 inscriptions, 50 sets of writing, and they were done by like 10 or 15 different people or something. But that's an example. Like if you have 100 soldiers left, they're soldiers, and 15 of them can write, that's a very different impression of literacy than many of us have for the ancient world. That's 15 out of 100, and these are soldiers who are not usually the highest class people. And so some of this thinking is being reshaped because yes, literacy wasn't as widespread, but it's very, very likely that it was more widespread than we give it credit for. It's not 1%. It's not just the tippy top of the social pyramid and a few people, maybe 10 people out of 1,000 that can read and write. It's certainly not 1,000 out of 1,000, but it's not 10. Does that make a little bit of sense? So scholars are debating this. There's thousands of pages that are written in libraries. You can read about it if you'd like. I would propose to you that I think, as I've looked at things more, in the Jewish community and the Christian community, education was taken much more, it had a much larger place in society and in the family. And so it's very, very likely that they start pushing literacy rates up. Now, not literacy in the sense that people were reading, hundreds of books like people can today, but literacy in the sense that they could read some things and probably write some things. They were also likely exposed to far more languages than we are, which is good for brain development. It would be almost unheard of for people to only speak one language in the ancient world. All kinds of places have another language in the town next door. So if you want to sell your clothes at the farmer's market, you better speak their language too. Okay, so we've spoken before. This is just a little bit of a review, but Christianity has to combat paganism. That's also part of the learning thing. How do you tell the pagans that they're wrong? Well, you have to know what they say, and you have to know why Christianity argues against it. Paganism was kind of resurgent. If you remember, Roman paganism is sort of this fun civic religion that's really strange. But they start having these mystery cults and these things from further east. You can read some of my notes on that. The Romans were more fond of like the gods of fate and fortune, Fata and Fortuna. That starts to give way to mystery religions and some of the Egyptian gods and goddesses and all those kinds of things. Christianity is trying to speak to this age and trying to make an argument for why those religions are wrong. That requires learning. That requires reasoning. There is, some of the persecutions are also, it's hard to look at them without the lens of spiritual creatures, demons, working against the spread of Christianity, because several very influential pagan philosophers kind of get in bed with the Roman emperors and say, you're having all these problems in your empire and plagues and separation and divisions and civil wars because the Christians don't worship the Roman gods. And so your state is weak because they worship different gods. Not your state is weak because of your incompetence. That would get you killed. So it's the Christians' fault. You can see this kind of spiritual battle. And it's really, really fascinating. It's really, really tragic. Because there are times, like there's kids at the high school, for instance. How do they find the one friend that brought drugs to school that day to get high? How does that happen? Well, if you say that it's all just random chance, it sure happens more often than random chance looks like. I would propose to you that it's one of the pieces of evidence that there are things devoted to destruction, the destruction of souls. It's the same thing at home. You might have had some alcohol. Like now that I think about it, for instance, my parents had an alcohol cabinet that I suppose I knew where it was. I just never really thought about it, so I never went in it. But some of you probably had kids, for instance, that were just snooping around one day and doing something dumb and discovered something that they shouldn't have. And it led to consequences and problems. Well, how did that happen? Again, it sure seems to happen more often than random chance. I think this is one of the examples that some of the persecution of Christianity was motivated by important pagans that get the ear of the Roman emperor. And I think it's hard to argue how that happens and the blame that was placed on Christians without thinking that there's someone that wants to destroy Christianity. It doesn't work, but it sure looks like that. I mean, like the destruction doesn't work, but it sure is attempted. Christianity also has to encounter these philosophers, especially in North Africa. There's people like the Stoics. Stoic philosophy is sort of, I don't know, I could never be a Stoic. It wouldn't work. They really get stuck in laws of necessity and fate. Humans don't have free will. You're just sort of left out to dry in this world, and so you try to live as virtuously as you can because that's a better way to live, but it's not really hopeful, and it's not really, like, it's not going to lead to flowering or flourishing in the same way. They also encounter Platonism, and Platonism is something that has such an impact on the ancient world, and today we don't live in a Platonic world, but there's parts of it that make sense. So Platonism is a dualistic worldview. There's different principles at work. Platonism, there's the spiritual and there's the material. And so you see this. Like, you can look outside and you see a tree. And you look across the street and you see other trees. Well, you're seeing a kind of construction between an idea of what a tree is and the physical things that are present in the world. You have form and you have matter. Platonism has a kind of strong separation between them. And there's parts of this that are very, very accurate. Like, it's fascinating that you could go get on a plane and get off the plane in Africa or in another place with all kinds of things that you've never seen before in your life, and you could still classify them accurately. What's a tree? What's a cow? What's a rabbit? Like, all of those things, even though you've never actually seen them before. Well, how can you do that? The Platonic model is that there's a set of things called forms that are like ideas, and then there's the material things, and there's kind of a not super strong connection between them. But some of this plays into Christianity very, very well, because humans are composites of body and soul. We have a spiritual principle, we have a material principle, and humanity is where those two come together. Angels are just spirits, souls, you could say. God himself is a spirit, and the creatures below us in the hierarchy don't have the same kind of souls that we do at best, and maybe don't have souls at all